You should get a little notice saying I'm about to record. Okay, so if you want to ask questions, what we're going to do is we'll have questions right at the end at the plenary. But if you want to kind of note your questions, please do put them in the comments box. I think there is a comments box here somewhere, a chat box, and we'll collect them to put to whoever is most relevant and who wants to address them at the end. So the next thing I just need to do now is hand over the reins to Dave Hill, good comrade and friend of mine, who will be chairing this meeting. He'll obviously tell you about the timings and so forth, but you all know that if you're in a single entry, then you've got 5 minutes sharp, and we're already running over. So, but if there's more than one of you, then there's slightly more time. There's a couple of minutes extra per speaker. So over to you, Dave.
Okay, morning, comrades. Really good to see you. Kostas, do you want to say something before we start?
Yeah, I just want to say that I have to leave in half an hour because I have this meeting with the rector. It's an extra meeting. So comrades will excuse me leaving in half an hour.
Shall we, Alpesh, then? Perhaps it's a good idea to start with Kostas. Because James, Grant, Derek, me,
yeah, good point.
John, all come before Kostas. So
yeah.
Perhaps you'd better alter the running order.
Yeah, and when Brad comes in, he can come in at the end. So let's start.
Yeah.
Good idea.
Okay, comrades, really good to see you all. And there's some people that I haven't seen before. And being well known to some people is not like being known to everybody in this chat room, in this seminar. So hello, Vera, and hello, Rosi, who I know through reputation and publication. 40 chapters in this absolutely amazing book. This book will live, and it's a big, huge testimony to Alpesh Maisuria for bringing together 40 comrades, 40 Marxist scholars from most continents around the world. So well done is a bit of an understatement. You've got 5 minutes each. I shall stop you by waving at you, but you won't be looking after 4 minutes. And if you don't take any notice, I shall shout at you, but very politely. Okay, so we've got James, Avis, Grant, Banfield, Derek Ford, Dave Hill with Alpesh, John Rice, Kosta, Skordoulis, Rosi Smith, Nick Stevenson, and Alpesh and Brad Porfilio to wind up. First speaker then is actually Kosta Skordoulis. 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Okay, I want also to thank Alpesh for this amazing work. And also thank you, Alpesh, for having me on board. I feel very proud about it. In my 5 minutes, I will give a brief description of my chapter. First, okay, and I will try to be as concise as possible. Why a chapter on dialectical materialism or materialist dialectics? It is important. The answer to this question in my mind comes from Trotsky directly when he answers to Eastman in a letter debating the class nature of USSR in the 30s, when Trotsky writes that I don't know a single case when epistemological differences did not take us directly to political differences. That's why I think epistemology is a very important topic to address. In my chapter, first I try to clarify the term dialectical materialism and pointing that this term is not included in Marxist works. In fact, it has been coined by Kautsky and Georgy Plekhanov. Marx uses the term historical materialism and sometimes materialist dialectics. That's why materialist dialectics is in parentheses in the title of the chapter. Then I try to give a definition of materialist dialectics. Okay, I will use the two terms as equivalent on epistemological grounds, not ontological grounds. And this is the main difference between non-sectarian Marxism and Stalinist Marxism. Dialectical materialism as such has been used extensively in the works of Stalin. In my definition of materialist dialectics, I follow the works of my mentor, Ernest Mandel, in his two books, The Place of Marxism in History and From Class Society to Communism. There are really two good chapters in there on materialist dialectics. Then I address controversies within the wider body of Marxism concerning two important works of classical Marxism, Dialectics of Nature by Friedrich Engels and Introduction to Historical Materialism by Nikolai Bukharin. And those two works have been criticized heavily as being the basis of mechanical and deterministic Marxism. And I try to prove in the chapter that this is not the case. This is not valid. In fact, it has been used by what is called the current of Western Marxism, heavily influenced by the Frankfurt School. I give an exposition of the contents and the origins of two important works and the validity they have for a new emergentist materialism, which is what we're looking for.
1 minute left.
1 minute, good. Okay, and in the last part of my chapter, I try to envisage a new ecological materialism to describe the transition from the classical works of dialectical materialism to a new ecological materialism. In fact, I'm trying to give a reinterpretation of John Bellamy Foster's work, and therefore I give an exposition of how Marx has been influenced by the works of Epicurus and the works of Darwin. In fact, I stick more on Epicurus because Epicurus is the subject of Marxist PhD thesis, and I do have the position that Marx started as a natural philosopher of the day and not as a Hegelian as such. The influence of Hegel comes at a later stage. And I think, this whole idea is very important to describe our new politics and found our new politics based on eco-Marxism and eco-socialism, because I think we have to give a new inspiration to Marxism in conjunction with the debating green theories and ecologists.
Okay, thank you, Kostas. We're going to move straight on. We're going to go through these, shoot through these presentations. The next speaker is James Avis, who can introduce his topic for himself. James.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me. Yeah. I always worry because quite often I start and it's muted or something goes wrong. Okay, my intro was about the fourth industrial revolution. And importantly, I engage with the imaginary of the fourth industrial revolution. And importantly, it's an imaginary. Its relationship to some of the arguments about post-capitalism, wage labor, post-capitalism, and importantly, the salience of vocational education in these new or emerging conditions. An important theme or question around the fourth IR concerns whether the affordances of the fourth industrial revolution can be appropriated by a progressive project. At the same time, and this is important, it's necessary to acknowledge that the technologies surrounding the fourth industrial revolution are entwined with capitalist interests. So on one level, they're entwined with capitalist interests, there's another question about whether or not they can be bent to serve progressive ends. However, the starting point for the discussion in the chapter is with the imaginary of the fourth IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, and its relationship with neoliberalism and capitalism. If I'm talking too fast, just tell me to slow down.
You're doing great.
Okay. Thank you. Anyway, the imaginary of the Fourth Industrial Revolution is set on a somewhat linear trajectory from the first to the fourth industrial revolution. You may have seen little diagrams which talk about the first and then the second, then the third, then the fourth. What I'm going to do is just to comment on the third and fourth industrial revolutions and its relationship to the fourth. The third is talked about in terms of the development of personal computers, internet, digitalization, and with the fourth intensifying these processes, thus smart factories leading to the salience of cyber-physical systems. Thus, for example, smart factories would mobilize cyber-physical systems, whereby through the use of algorithms, production could be tightly related to sales, etc. These processes would be supported by the Internet of Things. Now, there are 3 points to make about this particular imaginary, this particular construction. Firstly, it represents an imaginary of processes that occurred in the early and advanced capitalist economies in the West and global North. Such processes, when applied to the global South, will be experienced qualitatively differently. Secondly, the implication is that the shift from the first to the fourth represents a linear and somewhat determinist trajectory, free from human agency and effectively from the play of class struggle. This notion downplays the existence of uneven development and the coexistence of a variety of forms of production in any social formation and their relationship with capital. Thirdly, the discourses surrounding the fourth IR is set on a capitalist terrain. It offers a technicist account that takes for granted capitalist relations of production and at best seek to mitigate the disruptions or tensions arising from this particular industrial revolution.
You're frozen, James.
Beg your pardon? Sorry?
You froze.
Oh, am I okay now?
You're perfect.
This morning I couldn't get onto my internet, so I was in a bit of a panic, and I'm in a room which connectivity isn't that wonderful.
And anyway, you have 55 seconds left.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. Okay, well, I was going to mention SWAB. You might know the name in association with the World Economic Forum, who's one of these awful people who coined the term the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I was going to talk about notions of the challenges and disruptions arising from the Fourth Industrial Revolution that are both cited by those on the progressive left, as well as people like Schwab. And one can see Schwab's work as an attempt to ideologically resolve the contradictions of capitalism, to construct some sort of image of the future in which the tension surrounding the Industrial Revolution can be resolved and solved. In other words, it's operating on a capitalist terrain. I would also, if I had
10 seconds left.
Say something about all of those things about wage labor, about vocational education, and so on and so forth, and about some of those arguments that talk about the potential of the society of abundance. I think I'm going to stop there. So thank you,
James. And you remain perfect.
Of course I was.
Okay, the next speaker is Grant Banfield.
Yes, thanks, Dave. Thanks very much. I'm not going to take any content out of this chapter. I'm not going to cover any of the content, really. What I want to do is talk about the chapter and If there is an argument in this chapter, it would go something like this, that there is indeed a productive, revolutionary, emancipatory use value in bringing critical realism into critical dialogue with Marxism. I spent many years exploring this conversation, and if after reading this chapter, that's what people walk away with, I'd be more than happy. As I said, there's no argument in here. It's really quite descriptive, and that's deliberately so. I'm hoping that the work will be picked up by Marxists looking to address some very, very fundamental problems within Marxism and social science more generally. Kostas, I was really interested in the direction that you're taking your work, of course, with the idea of emergent materialism and an ecological materialism. I think those are solid themes within critical realism that I think there's some much use value to be explored. So I don't want to talk what the chapter's about, more about its purpose, its intent and reasons why I think that it would be, has some use value. In the chapter, I talk about a conversation between Marxism and critical realism. I use that term deliberately because critical realism, being the kind of philosophical meta theory that it is, has no intent and can no way replace any theories of greater concreteness to them. All they can do, and is what critical realism sets out to do, is to be a kind of what John Locke called an under-labourer to science, or an under-labourer to practice. That means that it gets down on the ground and clears the conceptual rubble away from the feet of theories like Marxism or Marxian praxis. So I think that's a really important point to make, because many people, many Marxist colleagues believe that critical realism is a threat to Marxism. It cannot be a threat. Critical realism can't do anything in the world. It is a meta theory. What it does is clear the conceptual muddiness and rubbish around the feet, and clear the way for, if one would like to say, an emergent materialism. Do Marxists need a critical realism? No, not at all. I'm sure, for example, again, Kosta, sorry to go back to you always, Kostas here, but Kostas is doing great work of, I would say, a critical realist kind. But critical realism offers us a lead. I think another point to really be clear on here is that critical realism, or the philosophies of Roy Bhaskar, that's who I'm really talking about here, the founder of the kind of critical realism that I'm talking about here, was founded strongly in Marx, not against Marx. It was founded in Marx's materialism. If I can put just a twist on that, I think that Bhaskar might be saying that he puts Marx on his realist feet. So it's a realism that has always been in Marx. And Bhaskar attempts to bring this to the surface. In fact, Roy Bhaskar, in one occasion at least, called Roy Bhaskar the first critical realist. Now, he wasn't trying to, thank you. He wasn't blowing his own trumpet there, but he was acknowledging the debt, his debt to Marx. In the minute that I've got left, I'd like to say something about education. The final bit of the chapter looks at the possibilities that that bringing critical realism to Marxian praxis, particularly in relation to education, I try and bring that out. And if there is a final take-home message or a take-home plea in the paper, is that over a few years now, I've tried to develop a conceptual apparatus that brings together Marxian dialectics and critical realist dialectics. I lean heavily on Ullmann, the great Marxian theorist, to help me with this. And bringing it together, have put together a model which I think is useful, and I would love people to pick up on it and apply it in their work. So that's probably the final take-home message, Dave. I can see my 5 minutes is up, so I'm off.
Okay, excellent. And we're looking forward to the book that you and Alpesh have got coming out soon on critical realism. Looking forward to seeing that. Now, the next scheduled speaker, I can't see. Derek Ford. Is Derek here?
Derek is not here.
No, he's not, which is a shame because he's got a new book out published by Iskra Publications, an Australian set-up, Centre for Communist Studies in Australia, a new book out on Marxist pedagogy, which I'm looking for. It's free to download as well, so I'm looking forward to that. Well, if Derek's not here, then the next speaker is me and Alpesh on our chapter on social class. So do you want to start timing me, Alpesh?
Yes.
Stop me after 1/4 of an hour.
Sure. Right, go.
Okay, in our chapter, we talk about social class, and we locate the chapter within the global capital labor relation and within the class war from above, but of course there's class war from below as well. So we talk about the salience in capitalist society. There's nothing amazing about this, of the labor capital relation. And we look at various aspects of class warfare, including something that's not often mentioned, which is actual wage repression. And we can look at stats, especially from fascist societies, Chile under Pinochet, the USA under Democrats and Republicans, Argentina. And it'd be interesting to look at Greece and UK as well, about the actual huge decline in the proportion of the national wealth which is taken by labour as opposed to by the capitalist class. We look at objective and subject definitions of class, and of course we look at the objective task of communists, as Marx says, to develop class consciousness. We look at different social class schema. We look at Weberian gradational grading systems of analysing social class. And we look at the relational definitions of social class, which is to say the Marxist definition, looking at relationship to the means of production. We go on to look at two schools of Marxist thought and criticise them both. We look at neo-Marxism. We look at structuralist neo-Marxism, developing from Althusser, and we look at culturalist and humanist Marxism, developing from Gramsci, also very prevalent in the work of people like Henry Giroux. And we criticise them from a Marxist perspective, from a classical Marxist perspective. We look at how long have we got left, Alpesh?
3 minutes.
Oh, wow, bloody hell. Right. We also look at a number of discussion points, which some of us have been writing on, like Alpesh and Mike Cole and me and many other comrades for a long time. We discuss the negative impacts, the mystificational impacts, as Alpesh describes them, of the official definitions of social class, whereby they hide the capitalist class. There is no mention of the capitalist class in the official definitions. And there is also no mention of the working class. So the Weberian official statistical definitions, market research definitions, what they do is to hide the potential solidarity of the working class. Working class is not mentioned. We look at Marxist critiques of postmodernism, within which relations of production are superseded by relations of consumption. It's not your relationship to who owns the factory or the bank. It's actually where you go on holiday and what type of pajamas you wear. I made that bit up. Okay, so, and the final thing we talk about, we end up by talking about anti-capitalist struggle and the necessity for class warfare. We put forward a Marxist definition of class, the classic binary definition, recognizing firstly that class, the capitalist class and the working class are forever undergoing recomposition, but it doesn't alter the nature of the capital-labor relation. And we suggest that the class struggle takes place not just in our classrooms, our staff rooms, our schools, but also in the pub, walking down the street with comrades, at the meeting, at the demonstration, in political parties, in social organizations, national organizations, international organizations. And before I do a little advert, I'll do the adverts at the end for the conference and for the journal. I'll conclude by saying that class analysis we see as part of a revolutionary problematic to go beyond capitalism, which is not what left social democrats want to do, like Corbyn, like Bernie Sanders, like Tsipras, like Die Linke, Podemos, etc. And that we want to go, we don't want to simply make capitalism a little bit nicer with reforms, which can always and are always taken away. We don't simply want to manage capitalism better. We want to replace capitalism and go beyond capitalism into a socialist and ultimately a communist society. That's the chapter by me and Alpesh. Thank you.
Perfect timing, Dave. So I'll hand it back over to you, Dave, for the next speaker.
Okay, the next speaker is John Rice. So welcome, John.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Alpesh, for the opportunity. My chapter's on capital accumulation and education, and of course, accumulate, that is the law of Moses and the prophets, is what capital's all about. But it's quite revealing if you look at the actual numbers. Historically, Harvey suggests a 3% accumulation rate, Nielsen about a 2.5% accumulation rate. And that sounds small, but what I wanted to explore in the chapter was the implications, the longer term implications of that. That means basically you've got economies that double every 25 years. And if you project that forward a couple of hundred years, which is a blink of the eye in human species terms, we have roughly 1,500 times the current economy by 2300, which is really ecologically, I think we'd all agree, ecologically impossible, given that we've already begun a mass extinction at a GDP unit of 1. So given that, we've got, say, 40% of amphibians, 33% of corals, a third of sea mammals, 10% of insects, all threatened. We're already problematic at the size of 1. The virality of capitalism also, its spread and its globalization is something I explore in the piece as well. And notions of, the key notion that I want to really explore is one of entropy, and this is kind of what I'm trying to do with my PhD. The notion of entropy, the breaking down of ordered structures into disorder, obviously capital, that's what it's all about, everything melting into air. But if we look at it at another level of detail, there are certain econophysicists who are combining physics and economics, people like Wright, who have fairly convincingly indicated that commodification and markets are inherently entropic, and therefore they cause, just mathematically, what we get is these skewed distributions of wealth and the number of firms and what gets produced. So you get small numbers of firms producing small numbers of product types that dominate markets. We all know this surface effect, but that's really what's going on at a material level. So, you know, it's a kind of mathematical historical materialism. So the point is that the inherent entropy of capitalism causes a homogenization, and we see that very clearly in the biosphere with the destruction of species and the expansion of monocultures. But what I want to emphasize is that the same thing's happening in the human sphere. Just as we're commodifying nature and putting it into the capitalist circuit, we're commodifying human labour forms, traditional diverse forms. We're narrowing them down, commodifying them, and abandoning old cultural and linguistic behaviours and practices. And these large dominant firms are demanding certain types of culture, language, behaviour, and we're getting this mass homogenisation and cultural extinction. So we see 7,000 languages that we've got, about one disappears every couple of weeks. Food, clothing, behavioural protocols around the world, they're all following similar patterns. As a teacher of migrants here in Australia, you know, we discussed this. I discussed this with classes for 20 years, and it was a very dominant trend. What are the pedagogical implications of this? Well, given that kind of scenario in the next couple of 100 years, really, humanity will only survive long term in a post-capitalist context. We've got to have a non-accumulatory society. It has to be, this is the precondition for survival. And we have to start imagining the pedagogies that are going to exist in those contexts. I think just as we have to start planning and imagining, you know, how we're going to repair the environment and the ecosystem through that because of that homogenization and that extinction, we have to do a similar thing with cultures and languages. That's very much a pedagogical process. 1 minute left, John. Thanks. So in the last part of I explore what that kind of entropic homogenizing process is doing to education at the moment, and those things are all fairly well known, I think, to us all: the commodification, the emphasis on quantification, et cetera, the proliferation of English as a hyper-imperialist language, as the language of instruction globally, et cetera, and even I would argue national curricula are part of that process, with what we see with the extinction of dialects and local knowledges and so on. And the last part of the chapter explores the possible emancipatory humanist pedagogies, the need to begin planning for that post-capitalist society, which means actually acting now and preserving those cultural elements and those languages that we've got. And there are some very good models, even here locally in Adelaide, South Australia, the Ghana Language Reclamation Project, where the last fluent speaker died in 1928, but very good work by Rob Amery at the University of Adelaide has resurrected the language, and we now have at least 12 fluent Ghana speakers. And I explore a few examples of that kind of thing locally, but point also to other places, especially places like Bolivia, other places in Latin America where there are these indigenous projects, these ancient knowledges that, you know, probably, again, only under a socialist conditions, we can revivify and emancipate these long-lived forms of knowledge and practice that are currently so much under threat, just as the biosphere is under threat. So, okay, thanks very much, John. Thanks. Next speaker is Rosi Smith. Rosi.
Hi, Dave.
We've never met Rosi. Good to meet you.
Lovely to meet you. Yeah. So thank you to you, and thank you to Alpesh as well for all the work putting this together. So I'm a slight fraud here in that I'm not a theoretician, and I'm only a Marxist scholar in so much as I do empirical work in Cuba. And you can't study Cuba without studying the kind of the strands of Marxist ideas that run through that. The theory guide for this chapter is Michael Ortiz, but he is one of our Cuban contributors, and the embargo means that Zoom is blocked in Cuba. So I'm here representing all three authors today. So really what we talk about, the chapter is called Cuban-Marxist education, and this sort of hyphenated Cuban-Marxist term is a term that's really come up with the 2019 constitution. So previous constitutions framed Cuba as a socialist state informed by Marxism, Leninism, and by the ideas of Jose Marti. The new constitution uses this idea of a Cuban Marxist state, and they talk about all of these different elements feeding into that. So Marxism, Leninism, but also anti-imperialism, also pan-Latin Americanism, third worldism, and for the first time, because it's a constitution after his death, the ideas of Fidel Castro, as well as the ideas of Marx and Jose Marti. So the first part of the chapter is where I set out a bit of how that kind of played out through history, that idea of this thing that might be construed as Cuban Marxism. The second part, which Michael wrote, really talks in more detail about the specific ideas of Marx, of Marti, and of Fidel Castro, and how they fed together into the Cuban education system over the last kind of 60 years. So he highlights in particular ideas about the social functions of education, scientific secular materialist approaches, and the importance of labor and moral education. And then the last part, where Leticia Garcia, who's a contributor from a small community in the mountains in Grama province called Bartolome Mazo. And what we do in that chapter is we kind of run through the different ways that this Cuban Marxist idea has been practiced in education, and we use examples and testimony from that particular community, because I suppose what we're arguing throughout is that this Cuban Marxist idea is a very participatory idea of education and quite a grounded idea of education. So we try and place it in that particular context of a very particular rural community. And I think that kind of sums up the chapter as a whole.
Well, you're first person to finish early. Thank you, Rosie. And the final speaker, and I've just seen Bernard Regan in the audience. For those who don't know, Bernard for like 50 years has been a leading member of the National Union of Teachers in a London Teachers Association, where he won't remember this, but I first met him when I was a teacher on strike in the late 1960s. But Bernard's done wonderful work on Cuba, also anti-racism, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so welcome, Bernard.
Thanks very much.
Final speaker is Nick Stevenson. Welcome, Nick.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Perfectly.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. And many thanks for Alpesh for getting the volume together so quickly. I must admit, when I first got the email, I looked at the amount of chapters you were pulling together and the time frame. I immediately thought, and this is not an insult, Alpesh, because I don't know you. I immediately thought, well, he won't be able to do that. That simply isn't possible in that sort of time frame. But so, you know, congratulations for doing it. I suppose a bit like what Rosie's saying, I feel a little bit of an imposter because I'm actually not sure how much of a Marxist I am. So please don't all tell me off for that. I'm sure you can convince me otherwise by the end. My chapter is about the New Left from the 1960s and its relationship with anarchism. And one of the things that interests me about that particular period, not only because I think a lot of the ideas that were produced then are still worth kind of revisiting, is that a lot of the histories of the period either write out the Marxist side of the New Left, or they write out anarchism. And what I try to do is try to bring them together, because it seems to me that when viewed historically, they actually have quite a lot in common with one another. And the commonality, I think, comes around through, if we try and make sense of some of the writing that went on around education during this period, I would say it was a kind of revolt against the idea of the institution, and that people, what they wanted to do was to humanize the institution. The problem was that the institutions that we had created were literally dehumanizing people. And I think that this is, this is still going on today. I mean, each year I give a talk to parents and students about, the damage that that schools do to people, and almost always afterwards, people come up to me afterwards and tell me their own sort of stories. So I think this is still very much kind of there. Anyway, Illich, I think, is still somebody who's worth reading. Was he an anarchist? Was he a Marxist? I think it's really, really difficult to tell. And one of the things that he was really interested in was kind of, I think, to preserve the autonomy of the learner, that he felt that we're literally being crushed by these, the way that institutions were organized in this very kind of hierarchical sort of way. And one of the things he said that the idea of the institution was actually that they were pre-alienating people ready for the kind of labor market. And I read this book in the early 1980s as a sort of pre-alienated teenager, and I immediately saw my own experience sort of reflected back to me. So I've always kind of felt I owed a great debt to Survivor Illich and some of his ideas. But what's kind of interesting now, I suppose, is that to what extent that these sorts of ideas are kind of still around, or to what extent that they kind of disappeared. I do a little bit of thinking about that, and then I try and bring Illich's ideas in relation to some of the anarchists who then start to think about them and trying to apply them into more practical context. And I compare this to sort of Marxists who were also trying to think about how to kind of reform the institution, whereas unlike Illich, who wanted to sort of abolish the school altogether, who wanted to move towards a more sort of networked approach to sort of education, give everybody an edu card, and they could then decide for themselves what kind of education they would like to kind of have. The Marxists were trying to, I think, people like particularly Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson, trying to kind of humanize the institution, think about, well, how can we move the institution away from a sort of grading, measuring type sort of model. And the reason they didn't want to go as far as Illich, I think, is because they saw that comprehensive schools was a huge sort of step forward. I think that historically, education, as we all know, has been a sort of preserve of the kind of wealthy sort of elites, and that this was something that actually could be built on in the future. And this is really what this particular sort of debate was about, really. And it's that sort of tension between the two I try to kind of I try to drill down into. In the final bit, I then look at, well, to what extent this opposition still really matters now, and to what extent actually, when viewed historically, they're not coming from a place that's that dissimilar from sort of each other, and that there's the sort of tensions that are built up historically between some anarchists and some Marxists. I'm not sure that kind of serves us terribly well as we sort of think about how to kind of develop a more kind of humanistic type education where people actually matter, where they're valued, where they're listened to, where they're not kind of just processed through these sort of large bureaucratic machines. Now, have I got a second left, or?
Sorry, I forgot to say, you're 17 minutes over. That's a joke. You've take another minute.
Okay, well, just to finish with a final story then, just to sort of the reason I started taking these ideas quite seriously, again, I went back to sort of thinking about Illich and so on, was watching what was happening to my own children, their education, and it was my daughter who, when she entered into sort of secondary school, literally, I was getting the reports from the school, and it's very interesting, really. You get the reports, and they didn't know anything about her as a person, as a human being, and you basically got these bar charts where she was being charted as a number, and she was being told above performance, below performance, needs to improve in this, needs to improve in that. That was basically it. And you go to Parents' Day, and they've no idea who she is, and it's not really surprising given that you're living this. It's in this very large institution that were full of kind of top-down rules. The kids were sort of told what to do. Again, pre-alienating them for life in a corporation, largely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Well, now it's over to Alpesh, the volume editor, to chair a discussion.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you for brilliant, absolutely brilliant entries and chapters and the contribution to this second book launch. There's a few things that I'd like to say before going into the plenary. I won't take up too much time, but I'd like to pay tribute to particularly those people in England and also in Canada who are on industrial action at the moment. I think it's been such a long time now. It's been well over a year, many moments of industrial action and dispute. So I think, Nick, your university is one, Maria at University of Liverpool. There's lots of people who have contributed to Emmy, who have been having to juggle industrial action, just the general kind of terrors of neoliberalism and life every day. So, my sincere thanks to those people particularly. It's just so nice to see so many people that I know, and bringing people together in this way is fantastic. It's obviously better to do it in person, but we've got people all over the world in this meeting, from North America to Australasia. So that's fantastic to see everybody. Yeah, really good. One person who can't be with us today is Terry Wrigley. Many of you will know Terry and Terry's absolutely fine work in particularly teachers' struggles and curriculum reform. Terry contributed a chapter to Emmy just before very quickly passing away at the back end of last year, at the end of the summer last year, very unexpected. So the book has been, the book has an acknowledgement of Terry's life and contribution to all of our struggles. So the book is an almighty effort from everybody who's contributed to it. There's 40 entries, 51 authors, 14 countries and 5 continents. Before starting the book just over a year ago, I had a fully black beard. Now it's kind of peppered with white pepper, but hey, kind of quite, follically challenged on top too. So these things are stressful, but I'm really pleased with the way that it's come out. I think it really does feature the richness and the intellectual field and the scholarship that people who are writing in and on the margins of Marxism and education. It's a fantastic demonstration of that. And what I tried to do when I was inviting people was to cover the traditional problematics. There's really 3 types of chapters in the book. Those that cover the traditional problematics and people, labor power, commodity forms, economy, agency, structure, those kind of things. But also I wanted to demonstrate the new kind of boundary pushing thinking, as I called it, to use their term, boundary pushing thinking within Marxism, because Marxism is dynamic. It doesn't sit still, and it really does speak to what's going on in the world right now. And so here we've got kind of theoretical new areas of thinking. So we've got people who are drawn from critical realism, decolonization, disasters, AI, pedagogy, law, human rights, and all of those kind of new areas which aren't always associated with Marxism, at least not traditionally and historically. And there are those kind of third set of chapters where I wanted to provoke debate and continue the dialogue within Marxism. So the relationship or not with China, the way that intersectionality works, race, class, and gender. The book is all around kind of dialogue and keeping Marxism invigorated for reality. I end up in the introductory chapter saying, we need to keep our eyes and ears open to kind of new developments. One of the developments that I see as a possibility for us to move into is around the way that Marxism converses and dialogues with developments like new materialism, CRT, and of course technology. We've had James talking about that today. I just want to also say final few things, that a project like this, executing a project like this is a long project, and Nick alluded to this. But I think it's a deeply personal project. It was I approached it in a personal way, and particularly the writing of the introduction. The authors who have contributed to the volume are people who have inspired me or interested me in various ways. So some of you I know, many of you I don't know, but you know, I think there's a time to be sectarian. Some of you have said, I'm not quite sure I'm a Marxist, but that doesn't matter to me. You know, it's about kind of dialoguing with people who call themselves Marxist and not on non-Marxist or not yet Marxist, as Nick, you said. And that's the way that I approached the introduction too. I wanted it to be personal, not dry. And one of the things that, you know, the chapters do, taken as a whole, is to show some of the tensions and some of the complements between the different areas that we work within. And some of those areas were revealed today with Grant's work on reality and critical realism, and Kostas' work on dialectics and materialism. So the book itself, several people have asked, you know, can I get a copy of the book? The book is, you know, I didn't know this, obviously, as author, or many of you who are authors don't have a say in how much books are priced at. This book is prohibitively priced unless you're a multimillionaire, and I can't imagine many multimillionaires who are into Marxism. So most of us probably can't afford the book, but there is a way to get it. You can try just to send an email like Mike Cole did to Brill, and they might send you it, you know, especially if you're retired. That's what they did with him. But one way to get a copy of the book is to do a review. And all Brill are asking is to get some kind of positive idea from a publisher who might be able to publish your review, and they'll send you, you know, they'll send you a book, they'll send you the book. So I'm also looking for people to translate the book as well into languages outside of England. I think it's really important that we do that, dialoguing with people who speak Portuguese and Spanish, and Chinese and Hindi, and you know, there's a whole world out there that doesn't speak English, and I really want the book to be as accessible as possible. And that might be an entire translation of the full text, it might be to work with a team of translators, or it might be to do a 3-volume set of the translation, so it could be 10 chapters or 12 chapters in each volume. But I'm really looking for people to do that, and it'd be great to get particularly a new generation of scholars to do this work. So the final thing for me to say before I stop the recording and we can launch into a plenary is to say that this is just the second of 3 book launches, and I've tried to organize them to accommodate different time zones. The next one will be in about 3 weeks' time at the American Education Research Association conference in San Diego. If you're in California, join me there. It'd be nice to spend some time with people who have been part of the book in some way. After that, we then go to, or rather, I take the book to Greece, to Thessaloniki, the International Conference on Critical Education. And Dave can probably say a few more words about that in a moment. Keep in touch, you know, it's good. The book's aim and purpose, objective, raison d'etre, as I called it, I think in the introduction, is to create this kind of dialogue going. So join my Facebook group, which is Marxism and Education Renewing Dialogues. There's a whole bunch of different types of people from different parts of the world there. And the videos of these book launches will be available on my YouTube page. Yeah, you just need to search for my name there. So just leaves me to say thank you so much to people who have been part of the book. You know, Vera, who's in the room, who's been helping with the administration and the final part of the editing, and Dave for chairing in such an efficient way. And thank you to all the authors particularly, but also people who have turned up to this book launch to hear us today. The next book launch online, the final book launch will be when is it? It's in about a week's time, April the 6th, and that's going to be at 8 p.m. British summer time, and that's really to accommodate Canadians and generally North Americans. And I think there's going to be an awful lot of people there because it's been combined with postgraduate classes. So please do come along. Thank you very much, folks. I'm going to stop the recording now.